The War of the Worlds by H. G. Wells. Book 2. The Earth Under the Martians. Chapter 3. The Days of Imprisonment. The arrival of a second fighting machine drove us from our peephole into the scullery, for we feared that the Martian might see down upon us behind our barrier from his elevation. Later, we began to feel less in danger of their eyes, for to a look in the sparkle of the sunlight outside our refuge must have been blank blackness, but at first, the slightest suggestion of approach drove us into the scullery in heart-throbbing retreat. Yet terrible as was the danger we incurred, the attraction of peeping was for both of us irresistible. And I now wonder that, despite the infinite risk in which we were between starvation and a still more terrible death, we could yet struggle bitterly for that horrible privilege of sight. We would race across the kitchen grotesquely between eagerness and the dread of making a noise, strike each other, and thrust and kick within a few inches of exposure. We had incompatible dispositions and habits of thought and action, and our danger and isolation only accentuated the incompatibility. At Halliford, I had already come to hate the curate's trick of helpless exclamation, his stupid rigidity of mind. His endless muttering monologue vitiated every effort I made to think out a line of action and drove me at times, thus pent up and intensified, almost to the verge of craziness. He was as lacking in restraint as a silly woman. He would weep for hours together, and I certainly believe that to the end, this spoiled child of life thought his weak tears in some way efficacious. And I would sit in the darkness, unable to keep my mind off him because of his importance. He ate more than I did, and it was in vain I pointed out that our only chance of life was to stop in the house until the Martians had done with their pit, that in that long patience, a time might presently come when we should need food. He ate and drank impulsively in heavy meals at long intervals. He slept little. As the days wore on, his utter carelessness of any consideration so intensified our distress and danger that I had, much as I wouldn't say I liked doing it, to resort to threats and, at last, to blows. That brought him to reason for a time. But he was one of those weak creatures, void of pride, timorous, anemic, hateful souls, full of shifty cunning, who face neither God nor man, who face not even themselves. I'm afraid I have to disagree with recalling and writing these things, but I set them down so that my story may lack nothing. Those who have escaped the dark and terrible aspects of life will find my brutality, my flash of rage in our final tragedy, easy enough to blame, for they know what is wrong as well as any, but not what is possible to tortured men. But those who have been under the shadow, who have gone down at last to basic things, will have a more comprehensive charity. And while within, we fought out our dark, dim contest of whispers, snatched food and drink, and gripping hands and blows, without, in the pitiless sunlight of that terrible June, was the strange wonder, the unfamiliar routine of the Martians in the pit. Let me return to those first new experiences of mine. After a long time, I returned to the peephole to find that the newcomers had been reinforced by the occupants of no fewer than 3 fighting machines. These last had brought with them certain fresh appliances that stood in an orderly manner about the cylinder. The second handling machine was now completed and was busied with serving one of the novel contrivances the big machine had brought. This was a body resembling a milk can in its general form, above which a pear-shaped receptacle oscillated, and a stream of white powder flowed into a circular basin below. The oscillatory motion was imparted to this by one tentacle of the handling machine. With 2 spatulate hands, the handling machine dug out and flung clay masses into the pear-shaped receptacle above. At the same time, with another arm, it periodically opened a door and removed rusty and blackened clinkers from the middle part of the machine. Another steely tentacle directed the powder from the basin along a ribbed channel toward some receiver hidden from me by the bluish dust. A little thread of green smoke rose vertically from this unseen receiver into the quiet air. With a faint and musical clinking, the handling machine extended telescopic fashion as I looked. This tentacle had been a moment before a mere blunt projection until its end was hidden behind the mound of clay. In another second, it had lifted a bar of white aluminum into sight, untarnished as yet, shining dazzlingly, and deposited it in a growing stack of bars at the side of the pit. Between sunset and starlight, this dexterous machine must have made more than 100 such bars out of the crude clay, and the mound of bluish dust rose steadily until it topped the side of the pit. The contrast between the swift and complex movements of these contrivances and the inert panting clumsiness of their masters was acute. For days I had to repeatedly tell myself that these latter were the living of the two things. The curate had possession of the slit when the first men were brought to the pit. I was sitting below, huddled up, listening with all my ears. He suddenly moved backward, and I crouched in terror, fearful of being observed. He came sliding down the rubbish and crept beside me in the darkness, inarticulate, gesticulating, and for a moment, I shared his panic. His gesture suggested a resignation of the slit, and after a little while, my curiosity gave me courage, and I rose, stepped across him, and clambered up to it. At first, I could see no reason for his frantic behavior. The twilight had now come, the stars were little and faint, but the flickering green fire from the aluminum making illuminated the pit. The whole picture was a flickering scheme of green gleams and shifting rusty black shadows, strangely trying to the eyes. Over and through it all went the bats, heeding it not at all. The sprawling Martians were no longer to be seen, the mound of blue-green powder had risen to cover them from sight, and a fighting machine, with its legs contracted, crumpled, and abbreviated, stood across the corner of the pit. And then, amid the clangor of the machinery, came a drifting suspicion of human voices that I entertained at first only to dismiss. I crouched, watching this fighting machine closely, satisfying myself for the first time that the hood contained a Martian. As the green flames lifted, I could see the oily gleam of his integument and the brightness of his eyes. And suddenly, I heard a yell and saw a long tentacle reaching over the shoulder of the machine to the little cage that hunched upon its back. Then something struggling violently, was lifted high against the sky, a black, vague enigma against the starlight, and as this black object came down again, I saw by the green brightness that it was a man. For an instant, he was visible. He was stout, ruddy, middle-aged, well-dressed. 3 days before, he must have been walking the world, a man of considerable consequence. I could see his staring eyes and gleams of light on his studs and watch chain. He vanished behind the mound, and for a moment, there was silence. And then began a shrieking and a sustained and cheerful hooting from the Martians. I slid down the rubbish, struggled to my feet, clapped my hands over my ears, and bolted into the scullery. The curate, crouching silently with his arms over his head, looked up as I passed, cried out quite loudly at my desertion of him, and came running after me. As we lurked in the scullery that night, we balanced between our horror and terrible fascination. This peeping had, although I felt an urgent need for action, I tried in vain to conceive some escape plan. Still, on the second day, I could consider our position with excellent clarity. The curate was incapable of discussion. This new and culminating atrocity had robbed him of all vestiges of reason or forethought. Practically he had already sunk to the level of an animal. But as the saying goes, I gripped myself with both hands. Once I could face the facts, it grew upon my mind that terrible as our position was, there was as yet no justification for absolute despair. Our chief chance lay in the possibility of the Martians making the pit nothing more than a temporary encampment. Or even if they kept it permanently, they might not consider it necessary to guard it, and a chance of escape might be afforded us. I also carefully weighed the possibility of our digging a way out in a direction away from the pit. Still, the chances of our emerging within sight of some sentinel fighting machine seemed at first too great. And I should have had to do all the digging myself. The curate would indeed have failed me. On the third day, if my memory serves me right, I saw the lad killed. It was the only occasion on which I saw the Martians feed. After that experience, I avoided the hole in the wall for half a day. I went into the scullery, removed the door, and spent some hours digging with my hatchet as silently as possible, but when I had made a hole about a couple of feet deep, the loose earth collapsed noisily. I did not dare continue. I lost my heart and lay on the scullery floor for a long time, having no spirit to move. And after that, I abandoned the idea of escaping by excavation altogether. It says much for the impression the Martians had made upon me that, at first, I entertained little or no hope of our escape being brought about by their overthrow through any human effort. But on the fourth or fifth night, I heard a sound like heavy guns. It was very late at night, and the moon shone brightly. The Martians had taken away the excavating machine, save for a fighting machine that stood in the remoter bank of the pit and a handling machine that was buried out of my sight in the corner of the hole immediately beneath my peephole. They deserted the place. Except for the pale glow from the handling machine and the bars and patches of white moonlight, the pit was in darkness and, except for the clinking of the device, quite still. That night was a beautiful serenity. Save for one planet, the moon seemed to have the sky to herself. I heard a dog howling, and that familiar sound made me listen. Then I heard quite distinctly a booming like the sound of great guns. 6 special reports I counted, and after a long interval, 6 again. And that was all. That is the end of chapter 3. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next one.